Genesis 29, an exegetical and biblical theological commentary. Section 1, Introduction to the narrative context. The narrative of Genesis chapter 29 occurs within a critical cosmic transition in the patriarchal history of the book of Genesis. According to the broader biblical worldview, Yahweh responded to the corporate humanistic rebellion at the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11 by divorcing and disinheriting the rebellious nations, placing them under the secondary authority of lesser divine beings, in accordance with the cosmic boundaries established in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 through 9. Immediately following this global fracture, God set his sovereign rescue plan into motion by electing Abraham and his descendants as his personal allotted heritage through whom all families of the earth would eventually find restoration and blessing. Jacob, the current bearer of this unconditional Abrahamic promise, now finds himself in a state of geographic exile in Padan Aram, also known as Haran, due to his own past patterns of domestic deception and self-reliance. However, operating under the structural banner of the Bethel Epiphany, where Yahweh swore to remain with him and multiply his seed, Jacob's arrival at Haran marks the exact historical juncture where the individual line of promise organically expands into the 12-tribe corporate architecture of national Israel. Section 2, Exegesis of Genesis 29. A. Providential arrival and the well encounter, Genesis chapter 29, verses 1 through 14. Jacob's journey to the land of the eastern peoples immediately brings him to a central local landmark, a well in an open field where 3 flocks of sheep lay nearby waiting to be watered. The text emphasizes a significant structural and cultural detail regarding local pastoral infrastructure. A massive stone covered the mouth of the well, and local custom dictated that the shepherds would roll the stone away collectively only once all herds and laborers had assembled. Upon striking up a conversation with the gathered shepherds, Jacob discovers that they hail from Haran and are intimately acquainted with his maternal uncle, Laban. At that precise moment, the shepherds point out that Rachel, Laban's daughter, is actively approaching the well with her father's sheep. Jacob immediately demonstrates an astonishing display of physical strength by stepping forward and rolling the massive stone away from the well's mouth single-handedly to water Rachel's flock. Following this feat, Jacob experiences an intense emotional release, kissing Rachel and weeping aloud as he reveals his familial identity as Rebekah's son. An intentional narrative contrast emerges when comparing this account with the journey of Abraham's servant to find a bride for Isaac in Genesis chapter 24. While both events feature providential meetings at wells, the text notes nothing about Jacob praying for divine guidance. This lack of explicit invocation highlights Jacob's continued reliance on his own natural vitality and strategic wit at this stage of his spiritual development. Laban enthusiastically welcomes Jacob into his home after learning of their kinship, framing Jacob's initial entry into the household as that of an outsider who is yet unaware of local societal dynamics. After a month of free labor, Laban prompts Jacob to define his wages, leading Jacob to formally propose serving his uncle for 7 years in exchange for the right to marry Rachel. Within the ancient Near Eastern sociological matrix, prospective husbands were culturally obligated to pay a substantial monetary bride price, known as the mohar, to the father's household. Jacob's contract of extensive physical labor serves as a direct substitute for this financial capital. The narrative shifts into deep irony as the 7 years pass like only a few days due to Jacob's deep love for Rachel, culminating in the formal wedding feast requested by the patriarch. The text establishes a stark visual contrast between Laban's daughters, dryly noting that Leah possessed tender eyes, while Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Under the cover of evening darkness, and heavily aided by the traditional betrothal veil, Laban secretly substitutes Leah for Rachel in the marriage bed. Jacob does not recognize the switch throughout the night, only discovering the stark reality of the deception when the morning light exposes Leah beside him. When Jacob furiously confronts Laban for breaking the covenant, Laban pragmatically justifies the switch by invoking the immutable local custom that forbids marrying off a younger daughter before the firstborn. B. The marriage contract and Laban's deception, Genesis chapter 29, verses 15 through 30. This justification introduces a profound layer of narrative irony. The younger brother, who previously used deception to usurp the birthright of his older sibling Esau, is now forcibly put in his place by a local custom that protects the rights of the older sibling Leah. Laban exploits Jacob's predicament by prioritizing collective family interests over individual romantic desires, offering Rachel as a second wife just 1 week later in exchange for an agreement to serve an additional 7 years of grueling labor. The narrative's structural framework shifts from a battle of wits between Jacob and Laban to a domestic matrix of maternal competition between the two sisters. Because Jacob explicitly favored Rachel and treated Leah with functional neglect, Yahweh sovereignly intervenes on behalf of the vulnerable party by opening Leah's womb while keeping Rachel temporarily barren. This division of fertility initiates a progressive sequence of births that establishes the foundational tribal lineage of the nation of Israel. Leah sequentially gives birth to 4 sons, with each given name acting as a rhetorical window into her profound emotional longing for covenant validation and her husband's affection. The birth of Reuben, meaning "see a son," reflects Leah's explicit belief that Yahweh has looked upon her domestic affliction and that her husband will now surely love her. Simeon, meaning "hearing," is named as ongoing testimony that Yahweh took note of her unloved status, transforming her marital isolation into a physical record of divine attention. Levi, meaning attachment, expresses her desperate hope that after bearing 3 successive male heirs, her husband will finally become fundamentally attached to her in a shared domestic bond. See household friction and the birth of the patriarchs, Genesis chapter 29, verses 31 through 35. The birth of Judah, meaning praise, marks a vital theological and rhetorical pivot. Leah deliberately ceases focusing on her husband's emotional neglect and instead resolves to praise Yahweh directly. The source text highlights that this initial sequence of births establishes the competitive matrilineal environment that would later incorporate the handmaids Bilhah and Zilpah, creating a highly fractured family history. Ultimately, this sovereignly directed matrix of births lays the groundwork for Jacob's eventual accumulation of wealth and his subsequent strategic return to the Promised Land. Section 3. New Testament appropriations of Genesis 29. Later biblical writers and New Testament authors organically trace the genealogical and theological streams of Jacob's expanding family to show how the historical and physical realities of the patriarchs find their ultimate fulfillment in the Messianic kingdom. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 2, the evangelist explicitly anchors the royal genealogy of Jesus the Messiah within the patriarchal line established in Padan Aram, deliberately passing over the preferred line of Rachel to trace the Messianic lineage through Leah's 4th son, Judah, demonstrating that the promise plan moves entirely through sovereign grace rather than human romantic preference. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 29, Paul's midrashic analysis of patriarchal family rivalries utilizes the systemic tension between those born according to the flesh, human manipulation and structural effort, and those born according to the Spirit, divine promise, to explain the internal fractures within the covenant community. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21, the author of Hebrews celebrates the enduring legacy of Jacob's mature faith at the climax of his life, a faith explicitly refined and forged during his years of grueling exile, deception, and domestic friction under Laban's roof. In Revelation chapter 7, verses 4 through 8, the ultimate cosmic configuration of the sealed people of God is structurally represented by the 12 tribes of Israel, demonstrating that the historical sons born out of the competitive marriages of Genesis chapter 29 retain an enduring, concrete significance in the final consummation of redemptive history. Section 4. Theological Synthesis. The theological architecture of Genesis chapter 29 provides a masterful demonstration of the organic unity and progressive development of Scripture through the lens of Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan theology. In strict alignment with the Deuteronomy chapter 32 worldview, Yahweh, having disinherited the rebel nations at Babel, concentrated his redemptive focus entirely on Jacob as his unique elected portion. The messy, agonizing domestic sphere of Haran is not a moralistic fable regarding marital ethics. Rather, it is the literal structural crucible of the seed promise. God does not execute his overarching redemptive goals through pristine environments or morally perfect characters. Instead, he uses the calculated transactional deceptions of Laban and the painful marital friction between Leah and Rachel to physically multiply the chosen family line. This narrative maintains a strict non-supersessionist stance. The historical realities of these 12 sons retain enduring validity for national Israel, as their identities remain structurally foundational throughout the canon. Simultaneously, the providential hand that overrules Jacob's self-reliance and redirects Leah's grief culminates in the birth of Judah, establishing the royal lineage that points directly to the ultimate cosmic fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Thus, the concrete historical events of Padan Aram serve a singular unified purpose: the sovereign construction of a covenant family through whom the true God will ultimately reclaim, bless, and reunite the disinherited nations of the earth.